evening. I'm Melanie Risden with the Western Standard. Joining me this evening are two Calgary lawyers. We're going to be diving into what is turning out to be a very confusing, very frustrating situation for many Albertans, especially with the lifting of some of the public health restrictions, mandates, masking, the vaccine passports. We're going to dive into this topic. First of all, let's introduce our two Calgary lawyers. We've got Catherine Kowalchuk. She is with Getz Collins, and she's a volunteer lawyer with Lawyers for Truth. We also have lawyer James Kitchen, who works as a volunteer with Lawyers for Truth and also has his own private practice here in the city, focusing on constitutional human rights law and employment law. Catherine more so focusing on family law. So thanks for joining me. And kind of an interesting time we're moving into in this province with mandates in some areas lifting, some are not. Catherine, why don't you fill us in on what you are seeing with regard to a lawsuit that you have brought against the courts?
Thanks, Melanie, for having us. Well, James is my lawyer, and your audience may recall that I am actually suing the Provincial Court of Alberta and the Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta with respect to discrimination I faced in December of 2020 regarding my entry into the Calgary Court Centre and the court's sheriff requiring me or wanting me to wear a mask and or provide my personal healthcare information to bypass that requirement. I was threatened with a $1,200 fine. And when I got into the courtroom, Judge Cornfield was seated in the courtroom, unmasked himself, and we had an exchange where he was requiring me to wear a mask on the public gallery side of the courtroom. And then after explaining to him that I had an exemption and that I did not have to disclose my private healthcare information to him, but in the interest of serving my client, that I would put a mask on under protest, he then requested that I step into his jurisdiction in the courtroom, at which point he said I did not have to wear a mask. Thereafter, he, in his office and myself, engaged in a letter writing campaign with respect to what the court's expectations were going to be of me going forward. And that was going to be for me to disclose my healthcare information to the court and abide by their policies. I had indicated to them that I didn't believe that they had any authority to demand that from me, and that they were violating my human rights and also discriminating against me, as well as I didn't think that they had any authority to require my personal healthcare information to be disseminated to them and or sheriffs that patrol the first floor of the courthouse. So that occurred some time ago, like I said, and James and I both were discussing this. We're both volunteer lawyers with Lawyers for Truth, and James agreed to represent me, and last July we commenced a charter challenge court application against both levels of the court. And James can speak to more about where that's at, but we've seen that the government of Alberta has removed all restrictions, mostly, especially the masking requirements throughout the province, and except for public transit and some other areas, which I still don't quite understand the rationale behind that, or the science behind that, in fact. Considering that masks are harmful, and it's not just my opinion, but there's actual expert evidence that will verify that. Not only are they harmful, they're useless in preventing the transmission of a virus. So what's concerning me now is that we as lawyers and the public received an announcement from the courthouse yesterday that, notwithstanding that the requirements for masking across the province are going to be removed, as well as other restrictions, that they are in fact going to continue with their policy under some sort of excuse that people are compelled to attend the courthouse, and that there is a vulnerable population attending the courthouse. And they provided no other rationale for that. But as you can imagine, I'm very concerned about this sort of a continued policy of the courts, and it just further supports the opinion that I've had for the past 2 years that the likelihood that we are going to receive any justice from the Alberta courts with respect to any of these mandates and the litigation that is ensuing and continues to be brought with respect to these mandates and government overreach will likely result in the courts deciding against us because they themselves continue to discriminate against people.
Mm-hmm. James, what can you say to this this notice that was released from the courts just a couple of days ago?
Well, I think it's really telling where the courts are at. That the government removes it, and let's pretend for a second that this has something to do with science or evidence or safety and not politics and control. Then any reasonable person is left asking, wait a minute, let's assume this is about safety and science. The government has said we no longer need it anymore, but the courts now are saying we still do. Even if I buy all this, that doesn't make any sense from a scientific perspective or a social policy perspective. And so the rational person has to say, well, what's the real reason? Well, we live in a political world. The real reason is politics, which, it's bad enough when the CDC plays politics, right? Considering they're supposed to be a medical institution, but you're not overly surprised and you're not terribly concerned. When the courts do that, I think if you're a reasonable Canadian, you are concerned, or at least if you're not, you should be. We're in a very, very dangerous spot when the courts are that politicized. I know this is a bit of social studies 11 kind of thing, but you have to remember that our whole system is predicated on 3 separate divisions of power in our government, right? You have the executive branch, okay, enforce, right? But they're not the ones to make up the law. That's supposed to be the legislative branch, right? And that involves all the MLAs or MPs, not just the majority party. Obviously, the majority can get whatever they want if all their people are there and they vote for it. But the idea is that there's deliberation, there's voting, right? There's that's the legislative branch, and then this third branch is the judicial branch, right? So the idea is that you can't have one person making the law, enforcing the law, and judging on the law, right? That's what a king does. And we've said, well, we don't want dictatorship or kingship. We want democracy. Well, in order to achieve that, you have to have division of power, right? You have to have all these powers in separate branches that can hold each other accountable. And we decided that like hundreds of years ago, after lots of people dying, to achieve that, because we thought, hey, this is actually a good thing. Monarchy's not a good thing, right? We learned that in Britain like 500 years ago. This is pretty foundational. We kind of gloss over it now, and that's part of our problem. But so bring it home to the courts nowadays, we have this problem where, okay, this is the branch that's supposed to, follow the law and be rational and bring in not only a sober second thought, but also that a sober second by hundreds of years of jurisprudence. And this is the realm in which we can test evidence from every angle, and it's all done in a very rational and sober way. And at the end of the day, we're that this thing functions because we have decision makers that are, although not perfectly unbiased and perfectly neutral and perfectly objective, we recognize that they can't be perfect because they are human. They're really close to that. They're about as close to that as we can get. Or ideally, that's the whole premise of the system: is these people are not politicized. They're not politically beholden, right? Their salary is not on the hook. Their job is not on the hook. They can decide anything, no matter how politically unpopular it is, because they're free to follow the law and make a decision based on the law and the facts, regardless of the political implications. And the whole system is predicated on that, right? The whole faith in the whole administration of justice, the repute of the administration of justice is all premised on that. Without that, that's just taken the rug out of the whole thing. And so this announcement puts all that into question. Say, okay, this isn't about science or safety. I mean, obviously, of course, they're going to say it is, of course, but it really can't be. It just can't be. What reasonable person would infer that it actually is? And therefore, the only explanation left, right, the best inference left is to say it's political. And if it is, then my goodness, we're in trouble. Because if the courts are politicized, well, then how can I trust that we're going to get justice on anything to do with this COVID stuff? And that's a huge problem. And it's difficult even to talk about it because, you get into this realm of, well, if the non-lawyers talk about it, then you're missing a huge piece of the conversation. But if the lawyers talk about it, they're going to get in trouble because the Law Society is going to come after them for talking about it. So it's a really difficult thing, right? I mean, everything I've just said, it's a very difficult thing to talk about because we as lawyers have to stick our necks out in order to even have the conversation because we're so highly regulated as lawyers by the Law Society of Alberta or the Law Society in any other province in the country. And but it has to be a conversation that we have to have, not just at Tim Hortons coffee tables, but at the level of media, at the elites, and talking about it in a grand political way, because we have a serious problem here. How are we ever going to get justice for all of the injustice that's happened the last 2 years, whether it's on the Hinshaw level or the private employment level or on the court level? How are we ever going to get that if the ultimate body that decides that and enforces that and has the social authority to do so is itself not able to think clearly or to objectively analyze the situation or able to be honest with itself and with the public about its decisions?
So James and Catherine, where have each of you seen this play out as well beyond this specific case?
With respect to the courts?
Yeah, where have you seen this bias? Do you have any other examples? Can you speak to that at all? Or
I have a few.
Go ahead, James.
I mean, let's use what I think might be the most obvious example right now. Tamara, I think her last name is Leash or something like that. Forgive me if I've missaid it, but I think everybody knows who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. She's one of the organizers from the Freedom Convoy. She
was denied bail. Okay. And what did she do, right? I mean, she didn't hurt anybody. She didn't commit any serious indictable criminal offense, right? She wasn't putting anybody in any kind of jeopardy. If you're a reasonable person and can think objectively, right? She did nothing that would warrant being held in custody. Okay, from any objective point of view. And who was it that sat on her case? Not merely a Trudeau appointee. Okay, a lot of judges are appointed by Trudeau. A lot of judges are appointed by the Liberal Party of Canada. That's how it goes. And we shouldn't automatically assume that they're going to be pro-government and anti-freedom and anti-charter rights just because they're appointed by a Liberal government. Although that does sometimes be the case. But this was no mere Liberal appointee. She had ran in the Liberal Party, right? She was aspiring to be a Liberal MP. Justin Trudeau specifically talked about how much, he praised her, right? Talked about her publicly. That's a problem that she was sitting on that case. I mean, there are hundreds of judges in the Ontario Superior Court of Appeal, the Ontario Superior Court. Okay. It's the biggest court in the country. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of judges on this court. Why was she the one hearing that? Okay. I mean, if I'm the court, I'm thinking, okay, let's try to make sure that we don't have actual bias. Okay. But the apprehension of bias, which is huge, that's huge. In law, we're all about avoiding the reasonable apprehension of bias because actual bias is very difficult to prove and it doesn't actually probably happen that often. But the reasonable apprehension of bias, we as a court, because we want to, have the people trust us and we want to, maintain the repute of the justice system, we need to avoid the reasonable apprehension of bias. We're not going to have this judge sit on this case. And we don't need to because we have hundreds of judges to choose from, right? So, I mean, her decision to hold Tamara in custody was egregious. It was Banana Republic type stuff, right? And I mean, I've represented two pastors that were held in custody as if I'm in communist China. So, I've seen that, and here we are again. I would say this is at least as bad, if not worse, to hold this woman. I mean, the famous comment from this judge who decided this is, I'm not convinced that you won't go and reoffend. I mean, that's something you say to somebody who's done a violent robbery. That's somebody who said,
and I believe her charge was counseling
to commit mischief was I believe, the wording of the so not even the one committing the mischief, just counseling to commit mischief. So
mischief is a pretty low level thing, and then it can be all kinds of minor things, right? That should be taken care of, but we're not talking serious crimes here, right? So, I mean, that's the most obvious example. I could give you a few others with just outright absurd decisions we've gotten, often from chief justices. There's a real trend in the country with chief justices deciding to sit themselves on key COVID cases. I just had the Ambassador Bridge case that I was handling in February. It was in front of the Chief Justice of Ontario twice. We were all scratching our heads and asking ourselves, why is it the Chief Justice that's sitting on this case? And it was a very, very frustrating case. It was very, very dismissive. Didn't want to hear anything we had to say about charter rights or limits on the injunctions he was giving. He just issued a permanent injunction when it was totally unneeded. The big Manitoba case the Justice Center did, it was the Chief Justice that sat on that. The case we did in BC with a church and a protester there was the Chief Justice that sat on that. And, us as lawyers, not being conspiracy theorists, are left scratching our head. Why are the Chief Justices sitting themselves? And why was it that justice that sat on that case? And why was it Justice Kirker that sat on all the original Justice Center cases in Alberta that, when she hasn't had that much experience, she was a Trudeau appointee. And then, of course, as soon as she ruled in favor of the government on these COVID cases, she was immediately appointed to the Court of Appeal, right? And again, this isn't like, conspiracy theory stuff. And this isn't like, automatically imputing corruption. It's just raising the conversation, raising what's going on.
And help me understand. Yeah. Help me understand. And some of the listeners who maybe don't understand, why would it be strange that these were all seen by chief justices versus, who would normally like help me understand why that is a strange occurrence.
Well, when it happens once, it's not that strange, but to see it happen so many times in a row, you're just kind of left scratching your head.
Because there are so many other justices that could be overseeing it.
Exactly. And ideally as a court, right? I mean, the kind of judge I'm going to appear in front of is not going to be the same one that Catherine appears in front of, right? I should be appearing in front of a judge who spent his career as a lawyer doing administrative law, human rights, constitutional rights, these weird areas of the law that are difficult that a lot of people never practice, right? When Catherine gets in front of a judge, it better be a judge that practiced family law because she's going to be a family law case, right? So, especially in my world, I often get in front of judges that don't have necessarily a lot of experience in these areas that the case is about. And they've maybe only been a judge for a few years. And because of course, a lot of the cases I do are quite legally complex, and you're left scratching your head like, that's odd. Just odd that I'm in front of this judge.
And the other thing is, James is right, and it seems to be that the same justices are hearing these cases. Associate Chief Justice Rook in Alberta was granted that ex parte order against Chris Scott and Pastor Art Podolsky with respect to not being able to gather and to exercise their rights to freedom of expression. And so when you have these, it just seems like these, going back to James's point about apprehension of bias, I mean, we're looking at a trend where these chief justices are coming in, or associate chief justices are coming in, and then they're even Justice Germain in the Art Pawlowski and Chris Scott case seized himself of it and or punted it back to Associate Chief Justice Rook, ultimately to determine how anything else would be heard with respect to it. So it's very concerning that these courts, especially in light of the fact that the rest of the country seems to be the rest of the other provinces anyway, not the country because we have our own issues with Trudeau, but the rest of the provinces are lifting these mandates. And so it boggles my mind why the courts feel that they are this moral superiority over this issue, and how possibly they can justify it. And not only that, where are we going to go for relief? And it's the same thing that I have in my case right now, where I'm suing the very level of court that is supposed to decide this matter, right?
And so how does that work out for you then? Who presides over that case if you're suing the actual courts?
James?
Does that sounds like it would be tricky?
It is. I mean, ideally, you would get a Court of Queen's bench judge. Not the Chief Justice, because the Chief Justice was the one that brought in the policy, right? So you get this judge that wasn't involved in the development of the policy, right? And theoretically, this judge is because they weren't directly involved. They're going to be neutral and objective and unbiased. They're going to look at the evidence. They're going to apply the law, and they're going to come to a decision. But you have to acknowledge the human reality. Is that judge going to come to a decision that is contradictory, that's completely at odds, that's hostile to what that judge's Chief Justice has done, right? Really? Do you ask an employee to rule on whether or not their boss has done something? The Chief Justice is not judge's boss. That Chief Justice is not going to fire that judge. But you have to think about that, right? There's a human aspect there. That how do you overcome that, right? There is that reasonable apprehension of bias. It's not only the Chief Justice. That's his whole court. The court that he's a part of has decided this, and he's going to come out and tell the rest of his whole court, you guys were wrong, and we shouldn't have done this, and this is unlawful. He's going to declare that his own court's actions are unlawful. You need some sort of principled, courageous person with an enormous amount of integrity to actually do that. And unfortunately, I think the last 2 years has shown just how rare those people in Canada really are. They are extraordinarily rare, I'm sad to say.
And so where are you left with this case then? I know it sounds like you guys launched this, I think you said in July, correct? So where are you at with this?
Well, I slowed down on it for a number of reasons. One was because we weren't going to get anywhere as long as everything else had mask mandates. I filed it last July, and honest to God, call me naive because I'm normally not. When I filed it last July, I thought, okay, we're filing this now because we're done with the masks, right? The collective madness that's infected everybody is finally over, and we figured this out.
Yeah, when Alberta was open for the summer.
Open for good.
Open for good. Yeah.
I was skeptical, obviously, of Kenny and all this at the time, but I actually did think there was a decent chance, we would only go into partial lockdown in the fall. Mm-hmm. All my clients last summer were asking me, so what are we looking at in the fall? And I'm like, well, and so I thought, okay, let's file this and let's get the courts to back off of this. This is a good time. Everybody else is back.
Well, and because they had kept the mandate, they had kept the masking mandate when Jason Kenney opened us up.
Exactly.
Oh, so they kept it over the summer as well.
Yeah. So here we are, again, they have kept it when everybody else has removed it. Right. And again, if it was about science and safety, then, because science is kind of like it says this. And so if one person does this and another person does that, only one of them can claim that they're doing what science says, because science is not like, you can do A here and B here. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like masks either work in Florida or they don't, and they work in California or they don't, and they work in the courts or they don't. And they don't work anywhere. That's the scientific reality, right? We all know that. For those of us who are being honest and have the integrity to say it, we all know that after 2 years of this nonsense, right? So we know that. So what the heck is going on, right? We shouldn't be keeping it anywhere, but especially when we keep it in some places but not others, then it really exposes it for being a political play, because everybody knows they don't work. So why are we keeping it? Why does California have it and Florida doesn't? Because the politics are different, right? This is the reality. See, it's funny. I've been watching and listening to more American news the last month for some reason, and I'm really shocked at how honest they are and the way they talk. Clearly, I was born in the wrong country. They will actually talk about the fact that the courts are politicized, right? It depends on their political viewpoints for who they're appointed by, right? I mean, this the recent nominee by Biden. I mean, is he going to rule the same way that Kavanaugh's going to rule, or that Clarence Thomas is going to rule? The Americans actually know that, and they actually admit it, and they talk about it. They get it, right? Like up here, it's big taboo for anybody to talk the way I have the last 20 minutes, right? Sorry, that's the reality, right? Who would appoint me on the bench? Bernier would. I mean, nobody else would touch me. I'm a raging libertarian, right? I would uphold charter rights, 99 times out of 100, and I would say Section 1 is not met. That would be how I would rule, right? And I would do it based on the law, right? I mean, you look, Justice Brown, who's a former professor from the U of A here in Alberta, one of two justices on the Supreme Court of Canada who ruled in favor of charter rights more often than not. When he dissented in the Trinity Western decision and said, look, Trinity Western can have its law school, even though it has a Christian code of conduct that says, no gay sex allowed, it can have its law school. That's actually what religious freedom is for, is to allow religious minorities to have the integrity of their institutions and not allow things that they call sin. Even if the rest of us find that offensive, that's actually what religious liberty is about, is protecting minorities that believe in differently than us, right? Mm-hmm. So him and the other freedom-oriented justice on the bench, Justice Cote, they ruled in favor of Trinity Western. They actually cited way more case law in support of their decision than the 7 judges who said, nope, no Christian law school, not allowed. If the Law Society shut it down, it's totally a justified violation of religious freedom, right? So it's not like the law isn't on either side. Often actually the law would be more on the side of upholding charter rights. We actually have more jurisprudence in favor of that if you go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. Right? So it is. It's all about ideological perspective. It's all about political viewpoint. It's all about world view, right? Justice Brown's world view is a little more like the three of us and a little less like, woke Justice Wagner, right? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, right? And that's why he came to a different conclusion. They all looked at the law, right? And the 7 who ruled against Trinity Western had some law, and the two that ruled in favor of charter right had some law. In fact, even more. So it's not about the law at that point. It is about their differences of perspective on what's actually constitutional or not, what's actually good or not, what's actually right or not, what's actually, you see how I switched into those terms, right? Those are morally normative terms, right? I believe the world's a better place when people are free, right? Leftist wingnuts believe the world is a better place when the government is powerful and people aren't free and everybody's equal, whatever the heck that means, right? And so that's all about worldview, and that's what the battle is on the court. And the Americans get it, right? And that's why they talk so much about their nominations. We don't get it in Canada. You've heard me say this before, right? And so we just pretend everybody's just these little robots. You impute the law and impute the facts, and out comes the decision. No, it's not how it works. You have law, facts, political decision maker coming to a political conclusion if they want to, manipulating the law and facts to get there, right? Mm-hmm. That's why you can get a 5-4 decision on abortion in the U.S., right? Some people think that the murder of human beings inside the womb is a bad thing. Other people say, no, that's a woman's right, and that's a good thing, right? There's good arguments either way, but that's a moral normative decision. That's not like a computer decision, right?
Right.
So it's going to depend on the political viewpoint of your judge, and nothing more than that. Right.
So where are things at with the court case that you guys are working on together? What's happening with what you're representing Catherine for?
So I've filed one expert report. I'm working on a couple others. I filed Catherine's affidavit. I'm going to be amending the pleadings, and now I'm going to be looking to push it forward quite quickly now because it makes a lot more sense again. We're back into that situation we were last summer where the government has removed it, the courts have kept it in place. Well, we got to deal with it. So
now, as far as the requirement for Catherine to be showing or revealing her private medical information, that sort of falls under the human rights sort of constitutional protections there. Obviously, that's part of this case as well.
Yeah, there's the privacy aspect. So what I've, to get technical, what I've claimed is Section 7 of the Charter, which protects security of the person and liberty. Right. So a lot of that is wrapped up in bodily autonomy, deciding what you wear and what you put in your body, what you don't. Right. Being able to make those really important personal decisions. So there's that. And then there's the privacy bit, which is Section 8 of the Charter. Right. So we have a problem when somebody says, well, Catherine, I need to see your medical records for you to prove that you're medically exempt from wearing a mask. Right. Well, that's an invasion of her privacy. So then the question is, well, is that a justification, right? And it might be. If masks really worked, and the more people that wore them, the less transmission we get, and COVID really was this ravaging thing that was killing tons of people. Yeah, what, that might make sense. I mean, even raging libertarians like me and a few over there at the Western Standard might still have trouble with it. But a lot of reasonable, rational people could say, yeah, what, that kind of actually makes some sense, right? Because these things actually do work. COVID's actually killing tens of thousands of people. This is actually a pretty big deal, right? But the more harmful that masks are, and the less that they work, and the less serious that COVID is, which is the reality here, then we don't meet that threshold to justify charter rights. Even if you're a woke lefty, and it's really easy to justify charter rights violations, we just don't come anywhere near that threshold, right? So those are the rights at play: is the privacy, the security of the person because they're harmful, right? And your security of the person is about protecting your body, and the liberty, which is about protecting your bodily autonomy, right? I mean, it's a pretty darn big deal to be covering up your identity, right? To be covering your face. And I would say it's a particularly big deal for women, right? I mean, I don't know personally, but I have a lot of female clients who've explained this to me. And independent of each other, they've expressed very similar feelings and emotions and thoughts for covering their face. It's a really big deal. I mean, and we know that from the whole Muslim face covering debate, right? It's a big deal. And so to be telling a woman, lawyer or not, you gotta cover your face. You gotta cover your identity against your will in order to do this thing, even though these things don't work. I'm sorry, it's a big deal. And I mean, I would say it's about 18 months too late, but I would say it is and was the precursor to this vaccine thing, which was a lot more invasive and a lot, I mean, as harmful as masks are, they're not going to kill you, not likely to. The vaccines actually do, so that's and so that was a big deal, not just for itself, but also what it led to.
Yeah, and the symbolism around it, right? And knowing that if and what I like to think of it as, just it was a social experiment that went very successful, was very successful for these governments to see how many people would comply without a fight, and without even thinking about it. And it's to the point right now that the mask mandates have lifted, and you go out in public and the majority of people are still wearing it. It's like a massive mental illness has swept over our entire nation.
So when you saw this notice,
I have to laugh about it because I'm so frustrated by how this situation has been handled by our governments, that I just continue to be so perplexed by it. But because everybody adopted the mask ritual, I mean, it's stuck. And you know what? We're going to wear masks for the rest of our lives. Like, for what? I mean, it's unbelievably, it's such an overreach by governments and these institutions. And I know you want to talk to James more about the employment stuff, because how the governments have reacted right now, and with Jason Kenney saying things like, oh, well, private industry can go ahead and regulate themselves and make their own determinations, when for the last 18 months they've been saying, well, the only reason why we're doing this is because of science. So what possibly could these organizations use to justify it? And I'd love my expert in my court case to go toe to toe with a government OH&S employee.
Well, and so speaking of when this notice came down from the courts, I mean, I guess the way I look at it is I'm reading the notice here. It's talking about the fact that vulnerable segment of the population attend. People are a person often is compelled to attend court, but as you mentioned, I mean, people still have the right to choose to wear a mask. I mean, that is a freedom that anyone who feels vulnerable or feels safer doing so can choose to do. So when you saw this notice come out, Catherine, and I understand from even just speaking with you that it concerned you, even with regard to what you're trying to accomplish with your court case. Does it concern you, James, to see this notice as well?
Well, I mean, obviously for all the big reasons about where our country is going, but let's drill it down to that vulnerable sector thing, right? That argument is really interesting because it cuts both ways, right? People are compelled to come to court. Yes, that's right, they are. So we need to be sensitive to that, right? And often these people are in emotional distress in their lives. They're in a court case, they've been sexually assaulted, they're in the middle of divorce, they've lost all their money. You're usually in a bad place when you're going to court, actually. So you are vulnerable, even if you're not already vulnerable prior to that. And yet, so we're going to take these vulnerable people and tell them, you have to cover your face. You have to hinder your breathing. You have to show papers if you aren't able to, right? You have to show proof of vaccination at certain stages. That's not everywhere in the courthouse, I've learned. Or you have to show papers if you're not. It cuts both ways, right? Because you're taking these vulnerable people and you're compelling them and you're coercing them more than they already are to be there. And so it's
and not only that, like why are those vulnerable people more worthy of protection than I am? And it's exactly the same thing that James is saying, like, and besides which, I would love to see, and I think we will be making these inquiries as part of our due diligence and with respect to our court case, in terms of, okay, well, how many, what are the statistics of this vulnerable population you speak about that needs that requires the entire population in the courthouse to remain muzzled?
Right.
It begs the question too, right? If these things work, then the person wearing it's protected, aren't they? So the vulnerable person who feels like they want to and they need to because they're scared, they're able to wear it. And wait a minute, doesn't that protect them? So it begs a lot of questions, and it goes back to this philosophical problem of, do we help people? Do we make the world a better place by forcing them to do what we tell them to do, right? Because we know better, or do we let them decide for themselves, right? That's the philosophical difference between this woke leftism and the kind of libertarianism that I come from. Is we actually help vulnerable people, and we actually make the world a better place, since we're all about that, by letting them choose for themselves what they do, instead of trying to say mother or father knows best, do what you're told or else. That's what the court's doing to these vulnerable people, right? Instead of letting them choose, which, I'm sorry, that's a fundamental principle to our whole political judicial system, the fundamental right to choose. And the court is taking that away, and they seem to be blind to it because they're so wrapped up in their woke viewpoint of the world, where those of us that know better will tell everybody else how to behave.
Well, and I can speak to, like, even in my family law cases, I attend online because that's just the way it is right now. So I attend online, and the justices are so concerned and go on for about 5 or 10 minutes about making sure they don't offend anybody, and everybody please tell me your pronoun, and so don't be offended if I blah 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 blah. And I'm just going, wow, this is really what we've devolved into, right? This hyper vigilant, worrisome behavior that we are going to hurt people's feelings, where we acknowledge various obscure genders that never ever occurred on planet Earth before, I believe. This is why Lawyers for Truth has been so adamant about this mask issue from the very beginning, and why we've always said, do not comply with respect to these mandates, is because of this sort of nonsensical decision making and mandate making that these governments and now our judicial branch seems to be making without any sort of evidence or justification whatsoever. And then we have a population of people that just go, okay. Like this is where we're at as a society. And it's not everybody, of course, but how many people, I can tell you how many lawyers I know in Alberta that have stood up against this tyranny that we faced with this government overreach. And I think I'm the only one that I know of that has pushed back with respect to the courts.
Well, and it's introduced so much confusion, so much gray area, so many unanswered questions right now. And as you alluded to, Catherine, we need to address the idea that the narrative coming from our provincial government is we need to do away with this divisiveness, right? That has come from these mandates and how it's divided people. Yet we're in this weird zone where the government has lifted the mandates, the vaccine mandates, and for the most part, like you mentioned, the mask mandates, with exception to public transportation and medical facilities at this point. But we're this gray area where, for instance, employers in private industry. I mean, let's back up for a second. So even when the province was discussing the lifting of these mandates, they put pressure on the post-secondary institutions that they need to come in line with the provincial mandates. We even saw that push, between the municipalities and the provincial government, as far as who gets to call the shots here, right? And so now we're in this strange world where the government has lifted it in most places, but yet we have all of this private industry, private employers that are still mandating not only masking, but the proof of vaccination for their employees. And I know I have been bombarded with emails from a lot of people from the oil and gas sector saying, hey, what happens now that the province has lifted this, but yet our employers are still, and then you're in this gray area too, where, for instance, oil and gas is regulated under the government. You look at, I had a student reach out to me and talk about an even more confusing gray area. This poor student is a medical student going for their to become a doctor, and as the post-secondary institutions are doing away with the vaccine mandates and allowing students back into their education and their classes and on campus, these medical students are needing to do their residencies in AHS facilities, hospitals. If AHS doesn't lift these mandates, then these poor students are left in this weird sort of middle zone where they can't even finish their degrees. So, James, can you speak to this a little bit about the fact that a lot of these employees who have been put on pay or put on leave without pay, fired, left, whatever the case may be for them, they're still dealing with this aftermath?
Yeah. Well, okay, so legally, I get this question all the time. So legally, yes, if the government doesn't intervene, the employers can do whatever they want unless and until the courts rule against them when they launch a case, right? Which, depending on your political philosophical viewpoint, that can be a good thing, right? The last thing we want is more government regulation, right? We already got way too much. And so there's problems with saying to the government, well, you need to go in and amend the employment standards legislation to prohibit employers from requiring vaccines in order to do their job. And that would be a good policy goal, not a very good way to achieve it. Giving more power to government is just evil. It eventually results in the murder of human beings. And I think the 20th century backs that up, even though that's a strong statement. So I don't like that. However, I would say that several states in the United States have done that, right? Republican states cannot mask kids in school, Mr. School Board. You cannot force your employees to provide proof of vaccination, Mr. Employer. Was that good as a policy goal? Yes. I don't like the fact that it had to come through government. I'd like it to come through the courts, right? One of the great things about the courts is it's a way to uphold rights, uphold justice, uphold social functioning, social cohesion, without the heavy hammer of an overly powerful, overly invasive government. The courts just say that's unlawful, can't do it, and then people don't do it because they don't want to be sued anymore, right? But you don't have this, government that's always on the tip of becoming tyrannical because they have too much power. And I'm sorry, if you have too much power, become tyrannical no matter how moral of a person you are. That would be ideally the way to do it. The trouble with that, of course, is that right now we're having difficulty trusting that the courts are going to actually really follow the evidence where it leads and apply the law as it has been in this nation for 100 years in the employment law context, right? And plus, that puts a burden on people who have to, come up with the money and go through the stress of a court case and the risk of losing. And meanwhile, they've lost their job. So, ideally, as a libertarian, I'd like to see the courts come to that and solve that problem, and then that would be it. But I understand why a lot of people would say, well, the government should come in and do that. And so basically, what the UCP has said, well, it's out of our hands. We're not doing it. They could pass legislation, just like Republican states have in the States, to say you can't do this anymore. And that would be, I would think that would be in my opinion, that would be the morally right and the factually right thing to do. I have reservations about giving the UCP more power. My goodness, but yeah, they could just do that, right? So when they say, oh, we can't do anything about it, it's private industry. I mean, that's a load of crock, because they could pass legislation tomorrow, right, saying can't do this anymore. Just like they pass legislation all the time that says employers, you can't do this, right? For example, you have to have 19.5 oxygen on your work site. If you don't, OHS will come in and shut you down. I use that figure, by the way, because when you wear a mask, you have less than 19.5 oxygen, and so it's actually an occupational health and safety hazard. We regulate in that area for good reasons. We could do that here.
So my question too then is, does this not, now that the government has lifted these mandates, and I do understand that private sector can make decisions, but does this not allow for more of the discriminatory, the human rights violations, now that this is not sort of mandated across the province from the government? Doesn't it?
It was never
sort
mandated.
of empower.
But no, in most workplaces, it was never mandated. Got to remember
Okay.
that 90% of these mandates for all the people that did them, right? And I think only about 3/4 of employers did this. They never had to. Right? Any talk from them that, oh, the REP said, we had to do this. No.
Right.
No. Look, in my cases, not in a single one of the many cases that I have, that my clients, the employees, have been discriminated against and unlawfully dismissed and all the rest of it. Not in a single case was the employer doing it because the government said they had to through legislation. With the universities and AHS, and yes, that was there, but there was never legislation that required these private employers to do what they did. They did it all of their own accord because they wanted to, and they're continuing to do it now because they want to.
So at this stage, then, does it then boil down to what's been playing out already? Is you sort of have to take them to court? This is the only option you have. There, it either falls under a constitutional challenge or potentially a human rights issue.
Only human rights if you fall under those protected grounds, right? Like if if the reason you couldn't take the shot was because of your religious beliefs or a medical disability, and usually the medical disability is impossible because you can't get a note from the doctors because they're too scared to, because of the chill effect from the CPSA, who's saying if you give too many of these, we're going to come raid your office and you're going to be investigated and punished and all that. So usually it comes down to religious beliefs. Almost all my clients, it's religious beliefs. But so let's say you go to your employer and you say, I don't want to take the shot. Well, it's not actually unlawful discrimination, subject to the Alberta discrimination, to the Human Rights Act and the Human Rights Commission, unless you fall into that protected ground of religious belief. So for a lot of people, right, some of my clients, it's just, this was wrongful termination. I was terminated with cause because I didn't take the shot. I was insubordinate. I violated their immunization policy. Well, that's not a discrimination issue. That's just plain old wrongful dismissal, which is the type of thing that happens all the time. These are weird reasons for it, but this type of thing happens all the time. And so that's their case. If it was, I asked for accommodation, they said no, they gave me no reason, they just discriminated against me as a Christian. Well, then you could go off to the Human Rights Commission and have a case. But if you didn't do that and you only just said, I don't want to take it because it's dangerous, you couldn't go to the commission. You'd have to go to the courts. Right. Gotcha. And it wouldn't be a constitutional case. Unless it was a government employer. If it's a government employer, yeah, your charter rights are engaged. When you go to court, you can, in addition to pleading the common law employment rights, you can plead charter rights. And then it's a whole separate issue, of course, if you're part of a union, because then you're stuck with the labor union and the labor relations regime, and that's another mess. You can't go to the courts.
Well, it still seems like, even though there's a lot of people who've kind of like, whoof, we're out of it. I don't think we're quite there yet.
We're not even close to being out of it. And this should worry everybody, because Jason Kenney has said, I mean, as far as I know, we're still under a state of emergency. I don't think that has actually been, I don't think that they've actually withdrawn that. And the other thing is, we have hanging over our heads as well the threat that, well, this could happen, we could have to bring back these mandates, should whatever threshold that's made up at the time seem fitting for them to do so. And so, and then we have this other issue that you've raised here today, like the courts continue with these mandates for no justifiable reason. Employers continue with these mandates for no justifiable reason. And, I screenshotted, and I think I actually emailed James the day that this occurred on February 13th, Jason Kenney, with respect to kids in schools and masking. And he goes, starting tomorrow, masks will not be mandatory for Alberta students while attending schools. And this is what I like. Kids must come first as we lift damaging restrictions.
Yeah.
What does that, really? Really? So are you telling me and everybody else, are you admitting, Jason Kenney, that these restrictions have been damaging to these children? You think? I mean, gaslighting that continues to go on with this government it's astonishing. It never ceases to amaze me. I hope one day I will figure out what in our brains makes us different than people who have bought into this stuff. Hopefully we'll get there one day. For me, it's always been about choice. We don't have any freedom. This is the thing. We do not have any freedom if we don't have privacy. What's the point? Yep. What is the point of all of this if all of my information is just going to be scrutinized? And, and now with the government, the federal government, with their ridiculous bank freezing fiasco and maneuver that they've done federally, and that they're going to be ushering in permanently, according to Chrystia Freeland. We have a long way to go, and I hope the next government that gets elected is not the UCP or NDP, and I hope that government does everything that they can to ensure that this doesn't happen again, including repealing ridiculous legislation like the Public Health Act that should have been caught 20 years ago when it was ushered in. We have now a responsibility as citizens. Now that we know better, we have to do better. And that includes holding these government officials accountable and getting rid of this legislation that has allowed all of this madness and COVID hysteria to occur.
I will check in with you guys and just see how things are going with the case that you have against the courts, Catherine. And, I just want to thank you both for an update and just an idea on talking a little bit more through how far we've come, but how much we still have to focus to get past, being mandated in many respects in our society still.
Yeah. Thanks, Melanie, for having us. And let's keep going, one foot in front of the other, and let's keep pushing.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks for your coverage of all this stuff. I've always appreciated it.
Likewise.
Thanks, James.
Likewise.
Thanks, Catherine. Much appreciated.
Algodex is owned by Algonaut. This is great new technology just coming online now in the digital currency world. Algodex is a great way for you to use the digital currency Algorand in your day-to-day transactions. Can you imagine a world where we don't have to buy a cup of coffee using the federal dollar? And you don't even have to use the American federal dollar. You don't have to use the euro or the pound sterling. You can use real money, digital currencies that are not at the beck and call of governments and inflation. The Algodex is making digital currencies usable in a day-to-day basis.